The Almighty sealed. 1,000 years ago, Yhwach lost his greatest power and disappeared for over 9 centuries. And yet, despite being the man who led Soul Society's greatest army against him, Yamamoto was never considered a special threat by Yhwach. So how did Yamamoto help defeat Yhwach without ever becoming the opponent the Quincy King truly feared? Before we get anywhere near that answer, there's one detail almost everyone overlooks when judging that first fight. Yamamoto wasn't fighting a fully loaded Yhwach. He was fighting a Yhwach who had already lost the Almighty. Years before Yamamoto and the original Gotei 13 ever squared off against the Bleach, Yhwach's Almighty had already been sealed. You see, Ichibei visited Yhwach at Silburn, acting as a balancer overseeing the human world, Soul Society, and Hueco Mundo. Ichibei came with an offer, a non-aggression pact. Let Soul Society keep managing the flow of souls between the 3 worlds the way it always had, and the Leakreich could grow and prosper without any interference in unifying the Quincy under Yhwach's rule. On the surface, a deal with nothing to lose. However, Yhwach refused it, calling it a deception, and accused Ichibei of treating him like a child who didn't understand what was really happening. And he had his own reasons for hating the world. To Yhwach, splitting existence into 3 separate realms and forcing fear of death onto everyone living in it wasn't some necessary structure holding the universe together. It was disgusting. Yhwach believed real peace only exists in a world where life and death aren't separated at all, where nobody has to live in fear of losing the people they love. As the father of Quincy, every bit of suffering his people had endured sat on his shoulders, and merging the 3 worlds back into one was his answer. A way to build something free of the extinction his people had suffered. He'd spent centuries hearing the anguished cries of every soul that had ever returned to him, and the desperate vindictiveness of anyone still clinging to life just to avoid joining them. Ichibei and Yhwach were never walking away from that table agreeing on anything. So Ichibei showed him the truth instead. Visions of the Soul King's actual history, with Ichibei present for every part of it, holding what was left of the Soul King's mutilated body. Yhwach watched all of it, and for a second, it looked like the vision might actually work. He called it tragic, almost as if he had accepted what had happened. But then, he called it unsightly, pitifully repulsive. To Yhwach, the Soul King's condition wasn't a sacrifice worth honoring. Instead, it was proof of exactly the kind of world he intended to erase. That's when the fight actually starts, and this is where Ichibei's real plan gets revealed. He'd walked into that meeting already carrying both of the Soul King's severed arms fused inside his own body. When Yhwach activated the Almighty, Ichibei summoned the left arm, Pernita, keeping its gaze locked on Yhwach the entire time, while using the right arm, Mimihagi, to stop an incoming Hylic-File barrage in midair and fire it straight back to the Sternritter who launched it. Here's exactly how the seal activated. As Yhwach grips Ichibei's left hand, Ichibei admits that his eyes are troublesome, but adds that they can't see through the Soul King. His hand boils over, then explodes into a huge hand with an eye at its center, swallowing Yhwach whole. The 2 pupils in each of Yhwach's eyes then collapse back down into one. Ichibei tells him he shouldn't have expected to take the Soul King's power for free, then walks away, warning him his eyes will stay blind until the day he dies. That's the whole trade. Ichibei basically sacrificed Pernita to seal the Almighty completely, purely because his and Yhwach's ideas of how the world should work could never coexist. And that single decision is the entire reason Yhwach walked into his war against Soul Society with nothing left in the tank. Weakened, Yhwach led his army into Soul Society anyway, and Yamamoto and the original Gotei 13 handed him a brutal defeat. Quincy Extermination War. The Quincy Extermination War was a war of total annihilation fought between the founding Gotei 13 and the Leakreich, and at the center of it were Yamamoto and Yhwach. Before we get into the details of the battle itself, we need to talk about where this rivalry actually started. Because the bad blood between the Shinigami and Quincy did not come out of nowhere. Around 1,000 years before the modern timeline, the Leakreich set their sights on Soul Society. Yhwach led a full invasion into the afterlife, and his goal was not simply conquest, but to ultimately overthrow his own father, the Soul King, and in doing so destroy the balance between life and death itself. Standing in his way was the Gotei 13, led by Yamamoto. During that fight, Yhwach witnessed something that very few people in Bleach history have ever seen. Yamamoto's Bankai, Zanka no Tachi. But to actually understand what Yamamoto was up against and why this war happened at all, you need to understand the actual math behind it. Because this was never a simple good guys versus bad guys situation. Quincy vs. Shinigami philosophy. The war was a fight between two species that literally could not coexist without eventually destroying the whole Bleach universe. In Soul Society, Shinigami operate as balancers. Their entire job is keeping the number of souls in Hueco Mundo and Soul Society roughly even, because if that balance ever tips too far, the two worlds collapse into each other. When a Shinigami cuts down a hollow with a Zanpakuto, they're not destroying that soul. They're purifying it and sending it back to Soul Society to continue the cycle, souls leaving the human world, spending time in Soul Society, eventually getting reborn back on Earth. That cycle is what keeps the whole universe stable. However, Quincy doesn't work that way at all. When a Quincy fires the Hylic File into a hollow, the soul inside gets completely obliterated. No trip back to Soul Society, and definitely no reincarnation. While that sounds great if you're a human trying to avoid becoming food, it's disastrous for everything else. The problem is that every soul a Quincy erases makes the imbalance worse. Because those souls never return to the cycle, they begin piling up on the living side until the human world becomes too heavy and starts collapsing into Soul Society. And once that process begins, stopping it isn't guaranteed. Soul Society saw this coming roughly 200 years before the main story, back when the Quincy population was exploding and hunting hollows faster than the cycle could recover from. They tried asking the Quincy to back off and leave the hollows to the Shinigami, but the Quincy weren't going to listen because they weren't killing hollows for the fun of it. One important thing to remember is that hollow contamination slowly and painfully kills Quincy, since they lack the natural resistance that Shinigami have. So, from the Quincy's point of view, they were fighting for survival and protecting the humans around them. But to Soul Society, every soul they destroyed brought the world one step closer to destruction. Basically, although both sides technically shared the same goal, which is wiping out hollows to protect the people around them, the Quincy's method of doing it so completely, so permanently, is what actually drew Soul Society's attention in the first place. The Shinigami weren't just hunting a rival species out of hatred, but they were also watching a slow-motion apocalypse building in real time. And they genuinely believed eradicating hollows at that scale would eventually trigger the collapse of the world. An event that ends everyone, Quincy and Shinigami both. Because of this, the Soul Society wiped out most of the Quincy over 200 years ago to stop the worlds from collapsing under the effects of mass hollow extermination. Think of it as the trolley problem on a much bigger scale, and there was no choice where everyone survived. Soul Society believed that if the Quincy continued erasing hollow souls, the three worlds would eventually collapse into each other and end existence completely. So from their perspective, going to war with the Quincy meant sacrificing some lives to save all of them. So, in simple terms, Shinigami purify hollow so their souls can return to the reincarnation cycle. Quincy, on the other hand, completely erases hollow souls, permanently removing them from the cycle across all worlds. And because Quincy lack natural resistance to hollow spiritual power, destroying hollows was their means of survival. One thing I want to make clear is that the Purge 200 years ago wasn't even the first conflict between these two sides. In fact, there were two separate Quincy purges throughout Bleach's history. So, it's reasonable to assume the earlier one, which eventually led to the war between Yhwach and Yamamoto, happened for the same underlying reason. Soul Society didn't just wake up one day and decide to hate the Quincy. Of course, Yhwach and the Leechreich may have fought the Gotei 13 1,000 years ago simply because Yhwach wanted to conquer or destroy them as part of his ultimate goal of unifying the three realms. Real quick, if you're new here and want more Bleach Simply Explained, hit subscribe so you never miss a video. Anyway, the original Gotei 13. A full 1,000 years before that purge, Yhwach led the Leechreich into a war against the very first version of the Gotei 13. And the Yamamoto standing at the head of that army was nothing like the man we know now. As a matter of fact, the original captains were violent enough that Soul Society genuinely believed they killed Yhwach outright, when what actually happened was closer to a seal than a death sentence. Yamamoto founded the Gotei 13 roughly 1,000 years ago, and back then, calling them defenders was generous. According to Yhwach himself, that original squad was little more than a mob of killers wearing a badge. And that reputation is precisely why they were actually worth fearing in the first place. Yamamoto stood at the front of it as what Yhwach describes as a true demon of the sword. Someone who used whatever method to get the job done and treated the deaths of his own subordinates as barely worth noticing. It's safe to assume the other captains were just as sick in the head, or at least equally insane in their own ways. The original captains were Chika Shihoin, Kenroku Uzuhara, Chigiri Shijima, Danjiro Obana, Furufushi Saito, Nobutsuna Shigio, Batsu Unsai Katori, and Tetsu Kamoi, Furuoki Odagawa, Yachiru Unahana, Uhin Zenjoji, and Saizo Sakahone, each commanding their own division. Chojiro Sasakibe, essentially Yamamoto's subordinate, was there too. However, after the Quincy were exterminated, Yamamoto was no longer the same man. He had achieved the peace he wanted, and that victory slowly changed him from someone who simply cut down his enemies into someone who fought to protect people. According to Yhwach, that's the exact moment Yamamoto and the rest of the Gotei 13 turned into what he calls weaklings. A group willing to hesitate in the name of principles that meant nothing to him. Yhwach put it bluntly, saying the Gotei 13 died alongside the two of them 1,000 years ago. And he wasn't speaking metaphorically. In Yhwach's eyes, the Yamamoto who once terrified him disappeared the moment protecting people became more important than killing his enemies. Zanka no Tachi. Another important fact to keep in mind is that none of this happened because Yamamoto lacked firepower. His Bankai alone should tell you that. Yamamoto unlocked and fully mastered Zanka no Tachi over 1,000 years before the 1,000-year Blood War even started, during that same original war against Yhwach and the Elite Reich. We know Yhwach had seen it firsthand because when Royd, who was impersonating Yhwach, had access to his memories, witnesses it, he immediately recognizes what he's seeing and warns Haschwald exactly what the blade can do. Yamamoto himself confirms that Yhwach had already seen the blade centuries earlier. Back then, its power sealed every flame Yamamoto could summon into the sword itself, turning the blade into a charred weapon capable of engulfing anything it touched in fire hot enough to reduce a target straight to ash. That's the version Yhwach actually saw and remembered. But 1,000 years is a long time to keep training, and by the time of their rematch, the technique had evolved considerably. Instead of erupting, the flames can now concentrate entirely along the edge of the blade. A technique called Zanka no Tachi East Kyoku Jitsujin, which activates automatically the moment the Bankai releases. Although it doesn't burn and it doesn't explode, this ability can erase whatever it touches without a trace. To the point that even the Vandenreich's Blutvene can't hold up against it. Zanka no Tachi West, Zanjitsu Gokui wraps Yamamoto's entire body in heat exceeding 15 million degrees Celsius. A temperature so extreme it stops even looking like fire. Which means simply touching him while the Bankai is active becomes lethal on its own. If he doesn't end a fight fast enough while using it, the heat radiating off his own body is enough to burn everything around him, allies included. Zanka no Tachi South, Kakajuman Okushi Daisojin lets Yamamoto drive his blade into the ground and summon the corpses and ashes of everyone he's ever killed with those flames, turning them into limbs that attack on his command, powerful enough that he can call up individual bodies just to break the will of anyone connected to them. Finally, Zanka no Tachi North, Tenshi Kaijin is a single slash of concentrated fire and heat that erases whatever it hits from existence entirely. Yamamoto barely uses any of this throughout the whole series, and there's a reason why. Unohana herself, sensing Zanka no Tachi activate, silently hoped he'd end the fight quickly, because letting it run too long risks taking Soul Society down along with the enemy. Compared to the other Bankai in Bleach, which we explained in this video, Zanka no Tachi definitely has the firepower to destroy everything. But despite all of that, despite a Bankai capable of erasing armies and burning through the strongest Quincy defense that exists, Yhwach still never rated Yamamoto as a threat worth fearing. It's basically an insult, but one that only makes sense once you understand how Yhwach actually measures a threat. Interestingly, there's actually a confirmed reason Yhwach never tried stealing Zanka no Tachi during their fight. And it all comes back to how little Yamamoto revealed 1,000 years ago. The assumption was that stealing a Bankai requires Yhwach to fully understand what he's taking. And since Yamamoto never showed his complete power in that first war, there was simply nothing complete enough to steal. But once it's revealed that the man Yamamoto was actually fighting in the rematch wasn't Yhwach at all, but Roy Lloyd wearing his face, Yhwach clears that theory up himself. He was never incapable of stealing it. He chose not to because he believes nobody besides himself is strong enough to control that kind of power without it consuming them. That's exactly why he ordered Roy not to even attempt taking it until he personally returned to finish the fight. Even Yhwach looked at Zanka no Tachi and decided it wasn't worth the risk to anyone but himself. So, for those of you who haven't pieced it together yet, why couldn't Yhwach use the Almighty during his original war against Yamamoto? Because he simply didn't have it anymore. Ichibei had already stripped it from him. And that's important because the Almighty could have been the perfect answer to Yamamoto. Yhwach later admits that Zanka no Tachi is too dangerous for anyone but himself to handle safely. Now look at what happened in their modern rematch. Yhwach needed Royd's the Yourself and the Vandenreich medallion just to overcome Yamamoto. On paper, Yamamoto had everything he needed to wipe out an army like Yhwach's. But raw power was never actually the reason their original war ended the way it did. Sasakibe's Impale. Here's how the actual fight 1,000 years ago ends, and why the win wasn't as clean as the outcome makes it look. In the anime original flashback, Sasakibe hides among a pile of corpses scattered across the battlefield, waiting until the exact right moment to ambush Yhwach from behind and drive a blade straight through him. That single opening is what let Yamamoto finally cut Yhwach down. Notice what that actually means though. The win didn't come from Yamamoto simply outlasting Yhwach. It came from a blindside stab from his own subordinate, timed perfectly against an opponent who was already fighting without his greatest weapon. That's a very different story from the one people used to tell about this fight. Except they didn't actually kill him. They couldn't. Whatever the original Gotei 13 were dealing with, they lacked the means to destroy it completely. So they sealed him away instead and called that a victory. And because Yhwach was technically dead at that moment, even briefly, the seal Ichibei placed on him broke entirely. Exactly the way Ichibei had warned it would. His eyes would stay shut until the day he died. And that seemingly death-like state was the only condition that could actually undo that seal. That's the real reason Yhwach eventually got his almighty back. Kaiser Gesang. So how exactly did Yhwach awaken the Almighty again? The answer goes back to an ancient Quincy prophecy known as the Kaiser Gesang, which describes exactly how his return would happen. According to the prophecy, the confined Quincy King regains his pulse after 900 years, his mind after 90 years, his strength after 9 years, and the world in 9 days. Once the seal was broken, Yhwach entered a hibernation that followed the prophecy almost exactly. For 900 years, he had no heartbeat. For 90 years, he had no awareness. Then came 9 years of slowly restoring his power by draining the life force of impure mixed blood Quincy across the world. And that drain is what ultimately caused the deaths of Masaki Kurosaki and Kanai Katagiri. Yhwach was essentially rebuilding himself in secret, harvesting the power of Quincy who didn't even know they were connected to him. He took exactly what he needed, piece by piece, until his body and power were ready to return. Awakening too early could have ruined everything. Before those final 9 years were complete, Yhwach risked losing control and draining the power from his own loyal Sternritter instead. So he waited for the entire 999-year cycle to finish naturally. He wasn't rushing his return because for Yhwach, there was simply too much at stake. While this was happening, the surviving Quincy used their mastery of Reishi to create the Vandenreich within the Schattenbereich, a pocket dimension concealed in the literal shadows of the Serete. They basically built their capital right beneath the enemy's home, and waited. For 1,000 years, they watched Soul Society grow comfortable and forget the war that nearly destroyed them. They studied Bankai, developed technology capable of stealing them, and quietly built an entire military power in secret, right under the Shinigami's noses, from what should have been their final defeat. Why was Yamamoto never a special threat to Yhwach? If Yamamoto beat Yhwach's entire army and forced the Quincy King into 1,000 years of defeat, why did Yhwach never once treat him as a special threat? Losing to someone should be the easiest way to earn their respect. But for Yhwach, it apparently wasn't even close to enough. The thing is, Yamamoto had changed a lot over those 1,000 years. But Yhwach saw that change as weakness, not growth. The old Yamamoto would take any advantage he could and cut down anything in his way. The new Yamamoto started caring more about the people around him, even if that meant making things harder for himself. He became a protector, restrained instead of the bloodthirsty killer Yhwach originally respected. That change was the whole reason. Yamamoto refuses Orihime's offer to heal his severed arm. He hesitates to drag Ichigo into his fight against Aizen, reluctant to put him at risk. Even during the actual rematch against Yhwach, the very thing that gets him killed is standing his ground, carrying the weight of both Soul Society and the human world on his shoulders instead of fighting purely for himself. What's crazy is that Yhwach himself admits the old Yamamoto would never have fought like that. 1,000 years ago, Yamamoto would have cut his losses, focused only on winning, and walked away. There's one important detail hidden in all of this though. Yhwach admits that whenever modern Yamamoto truly loses his temper, he catches a glimpse of the man he used to be. For a moment, he sees that old demon of the sword he actually respected. Maybe that's the closest thing to a compliment Yhwach ever gave him. And even then, it came with disappointment. When Yhwach finally kills Yamamoto, he makes his point very clear. It was never about Yamamoto being weaker. The problem was that Yamamoto had stopped using every advantage he had. He had become someone who wanted to protect people. But to Yhwach, those people were nothing more than a weakness holding him back. Now we know that Yhwach keeps a private list of exactly 5 people on this planet he genuinely rates as threats. 5 war powers he considers dangerous enough to actually worry about. Yet the one man who's already beaten him is not on it. Because for Yhwach, power alone doesn't decide who's a threat. He looks at what he can't predict, what he can't calculate, and what he can't control. Even after 1,000 years of watching someone, if they can still surprise him, that's what makes someone dangerous. Sure, monstrous physical strength still counts. Someone powerful enough to break the normal rules of combat is obviously dangerous. But Yhwach also cares about something much harder to measure, such as growth. The ability to keep breaking your own limits and become stronger in ways nobody saw coming. He also looks at ancient knowledge and experience. Someone who has lived for a very long time and built up incredible wisdom can be dangerous, especially when that knowledge comes with the authority to name and define things. Near limitless Ryatsu is another factor. If someone's spiritual pressure is so overwhelming that you can't even compare it to normal levels, Yhwach takes notice. And finally, there's unpredictability. A person with enough intelligence and creativity to keep finding new ways to fight can become a nightmare for Yhwach. Because no matter how long he watches them, he still can't figure out what they'll do next. When you measure modern Yamamoto against all of those things, he barely checks any of the boxes. And it's not because he got weaker with age. If anything, he became even stronger. The problem is that he chose to stop being the kind of monster Yhwach actually feared. He traded that fear for something Yhwach never cared about, the desire to protect others. That's the real reason the man who once defeated Yhwach never even made his list of people worth fearing. And if you want to see how Ichibei sealed away Yhwach's almighty in more detail, including the trick he used to pull it off, we've broken the whole meeting down in this video. Click here next.